Um, I'm going to just say a few words about the UCL School of Pharmacy before I pass it on to Sarah Garfield. So we're incredibly proud to be partnering with the School of Pharmacies for the first time. We're doing this event with them. It's one of the most highly rated pharmacy schools in the UK, and as the oldest school, founded by the Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain in 1842, it has over 175 years of experience and tradition, throughout which it has retained its identity as a specialist institution dedicated to teaching and research in pharmacy and the pharmaceutical sciences. I'd like to invite Dr. Sarah Garfield to give us a short introduction to this event. Sarah is herself a teaching practitioner at UCL and also works at Imperial College. So thanks so much for coming here, Sarah.
Thank you very much for that introduction and welcome to everyone. So we're delighted at UCL School of Pharmacy to be partnering with the Knowledge Quarter and the World Health Organization to bring you this event today. And the event's really about bringing together the sciences and the arts to tackle the global threat of misinformation about health and about medicines. And the issue of misinformation is important to us at the School of Pharmacy because of the threats that false information about medicines might bring. And we have Professor Rob Horne at the UCL School of Pharmacy, who you'll be hearing from a bit later, who has a special interest in beliefs about medicines and the consequences of those beliefs for the decisions we make about medicines and for our health. So the misinformation about medicines can feed into those beliefs. And the traditional approach of combating science misinformation is by reiterating facts. And that's been shown only to have very limited success in combating misinformation. But through my colleague Oksana's collaboration with the World Health Organization and Fight the Fakes, through the Global Citizenship Program which she runs, she's been working with Chris Bailey to try and find a more nuanced approach to misinformation, using a combination of the science combined with arts and storytelling. So this is particularly topical at the moment with the COVID-19 pandemic, partly because the amount of information and misinformation that's around, and also because the pandemic, at a time of a pandemic, we can be more sensitized to believing misinformation. So we wanted to tackle this from both the science perspective and the arts perspective, and really engage with the public in a discussion and debate about that. So we're looking forward to that discussion today.
Right, so we're now going to be in for a real treat. We've got Christopher Bailey, who's going to be giving us a storytelling performance. How many of you have seen one of these on Zoom in the last 4 months? And so using storytelling and science, Christopher Bailey will give us a real life example, examples of how rumors and false narratives proliferate in a crisis. And in telling these stories, perhaps we can find hints of what fundamentally makes us human. Christopher, a former actor and playwright from New York, is the arts and health lead at the World Health Organization in Geneva. And the Arts and Health program explores the evidence base for the health benefits of the arts, practical implementation of arts-based approaches to improve health at the local level, and engagement with global media companies and personalities. It's an absolute delight to have you here with us, Christopher. Over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. No, it's a real pleasure. And I guess to begin with, why misinformation? Why are we having this discussion? And under normal circumstances, when we talk about the arts, when we talk about storytelling, the misinformation side of it, the fictional side of it, is not something that we worry too much about. But what we find, particularly in a period of pandemic, quite frankly, misinformation kills. We had a conference last week at WHO on misinformation, in fact, the whole field of infodemiology, which includes too much information, how to sort it out in a situation like this. And we're all familiar, with the different types of misinformation, everything from false cures to whether or not the virus itself exists. Is it a plot? Is there some kind of hidden motive, some agenda, etc. And all of these things are based on rumor, but it's also becoming increasingly clear that the intensity of this global catastrophe has been exacerbated by two factors. The first factor is a lack of preparedness. I remember when I first came to WHO 16, 17 years ago, I'm dating myself here, I went to a lunchtime seminar given by Mike Ryan, who today is in charge of the COVID response. And he gave a lunchtime seminar that was attended by about 20 WHO staff members. And it was on the 1918 Spanish influenza epidemic. And we were all listening, and it was a nice historical lesson. And he ended it by saying, the probabilities are that in our lifetime, we will face a global pandemic as devastating as this one. And sure enough, he's right. And over the course of the last 15 years, WHO has sounded the call, sent out guidelines on how to prepare. Even last year, it was mentioned as one of the top 10 health threats to watch out for, this sort of thing. And yet still, we were unprepared. Okay, that past is past, that's fine. But now that we're in the middle of it, to actually see the range of effectiveness of the responses and the less effective responses being hampered by magical thinking, by wishful thinking, by fear reactions, all of which lead to these stories, we have to start understanding it. And that's what that conference last week was about. There were a couple of interesting, there were a lot of interesting statistics that came out of it, but I'm going to just mention two. One is that of all of the misinformation that's on the internet, about 40% of it refers to doubt about scientists, scientific organizations, or even science itself. To me, as bad as some of the other misinformation might be, of false cures, etc. Last week, Google reported that in South Asia, the most frequent Google search was homemade COVID-19 vaccines, as an example. That to have false information about the cure and the disease itself is like the acute result of a virus. But by analogy, the more hidden long-term effects, which could be even more devastating, are the undermining of science itself and the difference between fact and opinion. That is something I think we all have to take very seriously. The second statistic that I'd like to put out there is that false information on the internet is 75% more likely to be shared than correct information. Now let's think about that for a moment. There are two reasons for it. One reason is because of the emotional tie to it. It comforts us or it gets us riled, and oftentimes facts do not necessarily have an emotional reaction, so it doesn't elicit a response. The other factor is actually trying to counter that misinformation. You share that to show how stupid it is and why it's wrong, and in doing so, you unintentionally spread it. And it's almost like a host to the disease. Even news articles that talk about the misinformation, particularly in the political context, will always in that third or fourth paragraph reiterate the false story that article is trying to debunk. And that sometimes has the effect of spreading that misinformation even further. So it is a Gordian knot that is very difficult to untie. Who spreads misinformation? You can look at that in terms of personas if you'd like, and some of the personas could be friends and family just gossiping. And in fact, gossip is a natural human sense-making ability. It goes back to the dawn of civilization, where different tribes may trade stories about what's happening that may get reinterpreted by their own experience, their own fears, and begin to morph into something else. But it's very old, and it's a human reaction, and not something that can necessarily be turned off. There's also the joker or the trickster, the persona who spreads misinformation because they can and they want to see the reaction. And then there's the con artist, and that could be somebody who intentionally spreads disinformation for some sort of economic or political gain that they perceive. And then there's the celebrity, the person who has a wide audience, a podium, and because of their influence, they feel that they actually have knowledge, and sometimes will pontificate on something either without realizing the ramifications that it has and the impact, and don't recognize their responsibility, or they actually think that because they have a large Twitter following, they de facto know more than most people about something, which may not in fact be the case. Now, if you put together all of these personas, what you'll find is that actually they include everyone. And that's sort of the point. Misinformation is natural to human beings, and that's what I'm going to go into with this storytelling. So what does WHO do about it? I'll just speak about that very briefly. We have a thing called the Mythbusters, where if you go on our website, we will take myths that are making the rounds. I won't repeat them here and spread them further, but you can go to that webpage and take a look and just in very simple language explain why this is a myth and what is the truth, and what is the scientific backing for that. We also, of course, when we see a false article, we will talk to the reporter and explain, professionally, what is the scientific truth on that. Oftentimes the issue isn't necessarily the article itself, but the headline, which is trying to be clickbait, and often on newspapers and on websites, it's written by somebody who isn't the author. So that can be very difficult. And on and on and on. But in all of those cases, it's essentially like a game of global whack-a-mole. Every time something pops up, two more pop up. And it's a Sisyphean task. It's not something that, it's necessary, but it doesn't get rid of the problem. So my interest as an artist, as someone involved in science, is less about trying to identify who's spreading information and getting them to stop, because that implies the kind of judgment. Rather, it's to understand why all of us might be prone to misinformation, and understanding the context of why someone may feel that story is more resonant to them. And to have a dialogue, if possible, to try and get at that and see if we can find that journey to an answer that is positive for not only the individuals involved, but for society as a whole. Because the fact is, what this virus has done is it has torn away this myth that somehow individuals can act without responsibility. The chain of human health is only as strong as its weakest link. And if you have a part of society that doesn't believe in a vaccine, that doesn't believe in social distancing, that cannot afford to stay home from work because of their economic situation, that does not have access to proper health care, the entire society and community is threatened, which is why we need universal health care. So to talk about why we're susceptible, I'm going to tell a personal story. You've probably noticed by now my funky glasses. I have terminal glaucoma. I have less than 5% vision. And I lost the ability to recognize faces over a year ago. And glaucoma, in essence, is a degeneration of the optic nerve caused by ocular pressure. And one of the things, it sneaks up on you slowly, which is one of the reasons why it got to be so bad with me, because you could write it off to things like headaches, being stressed, being tired, or whatever, until one day you can't see. And in my case, after I was diagnosed, I began to notice things like my brain actually trying to fill in the gaps. What I learned is that upwards of 80% of our experience of the world is visual. And the visual cortex in the brain is 1/5 of the brain's capacity, and it uses that computing power to create illusions. When we see, it's not like a movie camera projecting a light onto the screen on the back of our head. That light image, when it comes into our eyes, gets translated into signals that our brain then must interpret. And it creates illusions. Now, when it doesn't get enough information to actually create a picture that resembles the actual environment, it will naturally start to fill in the blanks. It will try and paint a picture on its best guess from the faint patterns of what you should be seeing, and it will draw on your memory, it will draw on your subconscious, to the point where I would be walking down the park and I would see in the middle of Geneva a palm tree. I would see people walking their dog, and the dog would actually be a baby triceratops. My brain was working overtime to try and fill in those blanks. Now, when my vision was getting extremely bad, when it was becoming like this white fog, I was recovering from cancer at the time, and I was on full chemotherapy. The initial diagnosis was that I had 6 months to live. Spoiler alert, I lived. When I began to notice my eyesight failing, I began to wonder, what could this be? And I looked at the indications on my chemotherapy, and I saw that one of the side effects was neuropathy. And neuropathy, of course, is a degeneration of the nervous system, and it's my optic nerve that's being degenerated. And I thought, well, if losing my sight is the price that I have to pay to be with you here today, then that's okay. That's a bargain I'm willing to make. There's only one problem with this story. It's not true. Now, I've done the research. Correlation does not equal causation. There is no connection between chemotherapy and glaucoma. But because the facts, limited as they were, fit my emotional need in a time of stress, I created that story to comfort myself, to give it a meaning, to move forward. At night, when we look up at the sky and we see the universe of stars above us, our brains cannot comprehend that randomness. And so we impose a pattern on them, and we draw that pattern on our mythology, our stories, our personal situation, and we project that up on the stars, and we call that the constellations. This is what's happening in the pandemic. It is a natural phenomenon. It's part of our evolutionary cycle. When we are faced with the unknown and there's little information available, evolution has taught us that we have a better chance of surviving if we act anyway and on the best possible story we can think of. The problem comes in when we don't evolve that story when new information comes in, when we get stuck on that story, not the story itself. There is a connection between arts and health. 70,000 years ago, at the midpoint of our existence as a species, in the short time that Homo sapiens have been on this earth, there was something called the cognitive revolution. We had already developed our frontal lobes. We already had begun some rudimentary tool making and problem solving. But at around that moment, two things happened that made us human. The first was drawing on the side of a cave a figure of a person with an animal's head, something that does not exist in nature. The first imaginative work of art. The second thing that happened was the first archaeological evidence of a healed femur. Why is that important? Because up until that moment, there was no species on Earth that would take care of its wounded. They'd be allowed to die. And at that moment in our species, we began to understand that sacrificing the efficiency of the tribe to save one person was desirable. In both cases, the neurological revolution that happened was two things. One was empathy, the ability to have mirror neurons, to have feelings in your head that are copies of the emotions of the person that you're observing, to feel something for someone else. The other is that magic what if, to imagine a future that is not necessarily inscribed in stone. And that could be fictional, that could be fantastical, like the figure with the animal head, but it also could be surviving this wound if we care for that person. It's this concept of compassion. Compassion comes from the Latin root. It means, it's compassio. It literally means struggle together. In that moment, those first healing rituals were also religious ceremonies, were also performances, were also athletic events. They were all the same thing. To create, to use narrative, to use music, to use dance is not just fiction. It's a sense-making ability to find a way forward. When that is harmful, that's misinformation. When that actually helps bring people together to care for each other, to spread correct information, helpful information, and to help us learn and imagine a better future together, that is the highest form of art. So when we say misinformation is bad, we don't mean that all fiction is bad. What we mean is that harmful misinformation is bad, and that by exercising this moment of empathy, we can make that bridge and start that journey. So there's an example of a war-torn country that had a child immunization campaign. And in one afternoon, a number of small children died suddenly. The rumor that started to spread about on social media was that the vaccines were contaminated. And WHO was asked for comment. We said we didn't know. We would send an investigator. The investigative team was sent. And sure enough, what we found out was that in this binary combination of medicines for this vaccine, the activating agent was in a bottle that was identical to another bottle in which was stored a very powerful anesthetic. And the labels were in English, and the medical staff did not read English. So it was a medical error. And when this powerful anesthetic was injected into the child, they went into cardiac arrest. Now, in the 72 hours in which this investigation happened, that story metamorphosized. It suddenly became more than just a contaminated batch of vaccine. In the rumor mill, it became an intentional poisoning of the youth by the CIA as an act of genocide. And this began to morph and morph and morph and morph. And what we began to realize is that the rumor itself was beginning to mutate and spread like wildfire. It had a viral reaction. And as an organization where we know how to stop the transmission chain of a virus, but we have less knowledge on how to stop the transmission chain of a rumor. So, as any doctor will tell you, when you are dealing with a patient and giving them bad news, they will respond negatively. They will, perhaps be upset. They might go into denial. They might blame you as the doctor for telling them the good news. In a pandemic, the same thing happens with health and science organizations. There may be a negative blowback by telling the truth. And that's to be expected. But the question is, how does one get beyond that? And rather than reject that emotional bond and the empathy, we have to embrace it. Just as a good doctor with good bedside manner will listen to the patient, will touch the patient, will involve the patient in the dialogue, so too in a pandemic do we need to involve the community in the story rather than just telling them what's wrong. And that leads us to the 3 H's. It's the heart, it's the hand, and it's the head. We begin with the heart. We listen to the suffering. We listen to the point of view of the other person. We share that experience. The second is the hand. What are we doing? Let's explain that before anything else. And then lastly, and only then, do we go to the head, where we actually say what we know. If we begin with just the scientific information, it will have a distancing effect. The person on the other side, even if they intellectually understand what you're saying, will feel challenged that they're being contradicted, that they're not being listened to, that you're, quote, not understanding. As an example of that, the other day, posted a Black Lives Matter post, and an old friend of mine responded with All Lives Matter. And knowing that this person was a good person and reasonable, I took it offline and I tried to explain to him the justice argument, the equity argument, the history involved in this, the statistics of systematic racism, and why that response was inappropriate. And of course, he didn't see it that way. And his response, frankly, was, well, you tell me, isn't it true? All lives matter? Am I not right? And of course he was right. And so I realized I wasn't going to get anywhere arguing rationally. So we just changed the subject, and I started talking about, my struggles adapting to my vision. And he started talking about the recent loss of his father. And I don't know where it came from. I just said, but don't all fathers matter? And there was this pause. And he said, okay, I get it. He felt his own lack of empathy and the hurtfulness. He understood. But he didn't understand from an intellectual argument. It's because he felt it. Because in our minds, the amygdala in the midbrain, where the seat of personality, of identity, of choice, of behavior, is connected to the non-visual senses, to the hippocampus and the long-term memory, and the brainstem, where all our primal passions are. This is the stuff of art. So the frontal cortex is not directly connected to that. So if we want to change someone's behavior, if we want to change their view, they may understand what is happening, but it's only when they feel it, when it's gone through the lens of their own experience, such as what happens in art, that the transformation takes place. The new neural pathway is laid, the learning moment happens. I'm going to end with just a minute or two of showing how this healing power can happen through art. The Greeks talked about catastrophe, and it was different than a disaster. A disaster was an act of God. There was no meaning to it. Terrible thing happened. Oh well. A catastrophe literally means an overturning. In a way, the COVID-19 pandemic is an overturning, in a social overturning, where our political leaders are powerless and we are all dependent upon the greengrocer. The actual event can be identical. The difference is the meaning we give to it and how we can transform it into something that is cathartic, that gives us a path forward. In the case of my blindness, when I was first diagnosed, it was like a death to me. The same reactions we are seeing in the pandemic, the same reactions that a person who's diagnosed with cancer, I felt, because in a way it was a death. The way I engaged the world was disappearing, and that felt like the death of what I knew. And I went through all the phases of it. I felt profound grief. I felt tremendous rage. I tried to bargain. If I only ate better, or if I did some eye exercises, something. And finally I arrived at acceptance, but that acceptance was more than just moving away from the negative emotions to a resignation. It was more than just managing the condition as best I could. It was making it a part of my identity and finding a meaning in it that brought us forward. Just as you willingly close your eyes to better savor a vintage glass of red wine, just as you willingly closed your eyes to better embody a beautiful piece of music in your bones, just as you willingly close your eyes to better trace the gentle slope of a lover's forearm, so too do I willingly close my eyes to share this moment with you. That's the positive side of story. Thank you.
Wow, amazing. Thank you so much, Chris, for sharing those personal stories and those insights. And you weaved it so nicely together. Thank you so much. We're going to have a Q&A, but before we do, I'm just going to show a little video. Let me just bring it up again on my screen and make sure I've got the right one. Here we go. I'm going to quickly just introduce Dr. David Navarro. So sadly, he couldn't join us today. He really wanted to, but he offered to send a short video message, which I think is great for us to have. So David is currently the co-director and the chair of the Global Health at the Institute of Global Health Innovation at Imperial College in London. He's also co-chair of the Forum on Climate Change and Health, which will complete its work at the World Innovation Summit for Health this November. And since March of this year, David has been appointed the Special Envoy of the World Health Organization Director General on COVID-19. So he's a man who really knows his stuff. And we've got a short video about this very topic, which we'll hear first and then jump into the Q&A.
Good day. My name is David Navarro. Good day. My name is David Navarro, and I work as Special Envoy of the World Health Organization for the COVID-19 response. I want to talk with you today about what I'm finding when I try to communicate with people about the issues in my role as Special Envoy. I find that there are many who are really quite challenged in coming to terms with this virus, with the disease, and what it means for them and their families. And then they get even more anxious when they start to consider implications for their communities and their countries. And I think it's quite reasonable that they should be asking questions, quite deep questions. And if they don't know about viruses in the way that some of us do, if they don't know about infectious disease in the way that we do, inevitably they're going to be questioning the whole basis on which we're working. Could they be wrong? Could they actually be all going down a pathway that just doesn't make any sense at all? Is this a hoax? Has it actually been manufactured? Is there a conspiracy? Several of my friends and family members have been asking me about a film called Plandemic, which really does set out an alternative understanding of what's going on. And I think I get why. Because quite simply, it does take every one of us really many hours, many days, many weeks, and many months to work through what this means for our lives, for the way we behave, and also for our view of the future. I think I'd just like to suggest a couple of things that's worth bearing in mind. First of all, try to meet people where they really are. Feel into their understanding of what's happening. Try to view what's happening in terms of health, in terms of life, in terms of expectations from their perspective, and then work from there. And secondly, if you can, try to understand what their perspective is. Try to understand the rationale behind it. Try to understand how they feel, so that you're not feeling yourself confronting them with a different knowledge, but instead working from where they're at. I don't think this makes life a lot easier. I think we're always going to be facing many people who question our view of reality. But I think if we can try to level with them a bit and appreciate that they have very good reasons for what they think, then I think it makes the communication a lot easier. And it helps us to work with them, to connect with their systems, and to enable them to find the strength to make sense of what's happening. Thank you very much.
That was great. And we're going to now go into the Q&A part of this event. I'll just very quickly introduce two more people who are going to join Christopher in our panel. First of all, Professor Robert Horne, who, Robert Horne, who is a Professor of Behavioral Medicine at UCL School of Pharmacy. He's also the Director of the Center for Behavioral Medicine. His research focuses on the role of psychological and behavioral factors in explaining variation in response to treatment. His work extends into broader aspects of health and illness, such as the placebo-nocebo effect and the role of language, emotion, and emotional disclosure in illness-related behaviors and outcomes. And Oksana Pizik, who is a senior teaching fellow and global engagement lead at the UCL School of Pharmacy, and since 2015 has led the Outbreak of Infectious Disease and Global Citizenship Program, open course focusing on epidemics and pandemics. Throughout the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, Oksana has been a regular contributor to BBC, CNBC, LBC, Sky News, Bloomberg, Channel 4, ITV, etc. So a real celebrity. As the founder of the UCL Fight the Fakes campaign, Oksana works with global partners across sectors to raise awareness around the growing global health threat of substandard and falsified medicines through youth advocacy, driving research, education development, and public engagement. I'm going to stop sharing the slide so that we can see our panelists properly. And if you'd like to unmute yourselves, Chris, Oksana, and Rob, we can start our conversation. And I just remind everybody that if you want to add any questions, please use the chat function. I'll try and weave them in as much as possible. And secondly, we are running a little bit over time. I think we will take the liberty of extending this event by 15 minutes to about 4:15. So if any of you can continue staying with us for that, please do. And apologies for that, but we want to have this discussion as much as possible. Chris, really, there's so many things I can ask you from what you presented. Very first, what do you think fake news will look like in the future? So in recent years, fake news has taken the persona of memes and adverts on Facebook and all of these kind of things. What will it look like in the future?
Oh, well, I can't read the future, but I do think that at least in the US, where I was from, one of the things that actually that took us down this path was when news agencies became when they lost their autonomy. And there had been some regulations which were struck down by the FCC a generation ago of keeping news separate from entertainment. And now most news agencies are actually run by the entertainment division, which means basic editorial choices are made in terms of entertainment value rather than journalism. And so how does that play out? Well, it plays out with things like making sure every debate on television has a pro and a con so that it's an argument. Creating a false equivalency on issues where there should be no false equivalent. Climate change is an example of that, where if you truly wanted to have a representative debate, you would have 99 scientists against one. But it's always shown for entertainment reasons as one against one. Yeah. So, but I don't know what the future is going to be like, but I would like to see a more rational approach to how news and information is presented and how it is contextualized for the general public.
Rob, I'm going to just continue that thread of conversation. So something that Chris mentioned in his presentation was the fact that a large percentage of all misinformation on the internet refers to doubt about science and scientists and their findings. But often scientists just don't agree with each other. And the scientists from one part of the world will say something else, and another part of the world they'll say something else. So often this line that, well, let the science speak for itself, or let scientists are the holy grail of all information. That's just not true. So how do we deal with that, and how can people react to that?
Okay, well, I think there are two things here, isn't there? Is the way we react to information is determined by a whole range of things. But I think one of the key things to recognize is we don't come to it as a blank sheet that the scientists or the people purveying the information can write on. We come with a pre-existing set of beliefs about what the information is about. So I think David touched on this in his talk, which is, if we look at the example of medicine, where we are trying to communicate a prevailing sense of the evidence for or against a particular course of action. There's always disagreement. The world isn't black and white, it's shades of gray. So the fact that scientists disagree, but we have systems within science for resolving those disagreements, or at least coming to a reasonable consensus. And that's things like systematic reviews, meta-analyses, etc. So the core of the problem for me isn't necessarily that science don't always agree, and there is apparently no single truth. But even when there is a degree of certainty, as it were, from the science side, it still often doesn't convince people. And the core to this is to understand that, if you like, the information action gap. And in the medical world, often the way we respond to that is we shout the information louder or in a different way. And the failing there is really a lack of understanding, or a lack of implementation of the simple understanding that in order to influence our behavior or our decision, for example, to take a vaccine for COVID, should one exist, the information has to do one of two things. It either has to agree with our beliefs about that behavior, or it has to change them. And to me, that's the fundamental missing link when we talk about information and misinformation, is really there are two ways of fighting misinformation. One is to denigrate and reduce the salience of the misinformation. But as Chris illustrated early on in his analogy of whack-a-mole, that's going to be almost impossible. And the misinformation machine will be continually driving. So the other strategy is to increase the salience of the information for individuals. And I think that's what David was mentioning, how can we communicate the evidence, if you like, in a way which takes account of the beliefs that people bring to that information. So, bring a professor along, they'll give you a 3-hour answer to a simple question. So I'm sorry that went on a bit long, but it's a complicated question.
No, I mean, we've had some promising news from Oxford regarding their vaccine. It's developing at a fast pace, but also some research in America says that only a third of Americans say they won't take the COVID-19 vaccine, even if one is developed in the near future. Do you expect that sort of same kind of trend to happen in the UK? And there is an anti-vax movement. Are you worried about that?
Well, yeah, I'm worried about the anti-vax movement, but simply that reflects my perceptions and beliefs about vaccines. So I'm worried about it because I think that for many people, it's due to a set of understandable, common sense beliefs, but that do not match the evidence. And my concern is that that can exclude people from potentially beneficial interventions. Now, to come to your specific question, might the UK be different to the US? I don't think we've got evidence on that yet, but I don't think this is a US problem. When you look at vaccination uptake rates within the UK, just looking, say, at seasonal flu vaccine last year, the uptake levels are much lower than expected. And there is some concern that that may partially be due to sort of social media and misinformation about vaccines. But to me, this goes beyond a kind of group of anti-vaxxers who seem to have very fixed views about vaccination and very detailed and in-depth knowledge about their particular evidence, as it were. I think what we're also seeing is that this is a spectrum from people who are probably very pro-vaccine, like me, to people who are anti-vax, and with lots of shades in between. And there is a large cohort of people who are suspicious. You wouldn't call them anti-vaxxers, but they may not be convinced of the necessity, and they may have concerns about vaccination that may be sufficient to prevent them from taking the vaccine. And the reason I identify that group is I think that they may be open to persuasion if the evidence is presented in a different way that actually takes account of their thinking and can make a convincing, common sense rationale for why they should do it.
Okay, that's great, Rob. I'm going to turn to Oksana. I'll come back to Chris and Rob in a second with other questions. We've got some questions in the chat as well. So Oksana, I mean, Chris talked about the different personas, the gossiper, the joker, the con artist, and the celebrity, who all have this sort of influence of giving information to people. Now, what happens when you have certain world leaders who are all of those things, the joker, the con artist, and the celebrity? And there's a question from Victor in the chat, which is alluding to this point. But, is there anything that can be done about the fear-mongering and the spreading of false news and fearful news that such individuals use for political gain?
So I think that is a question that many people are reflecting on, given the gravity of some of the claims that have been made. I'm going to give you a pharmacy-related example first about the power that certain individuals who do have these platforms, how that can directly have, in some cases, unintended consequences and otherwise. We did hear the US President Donald Trump frequently refer to hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine before there was enough evidence. While they were being investigated as part of a clinical trial, it was not the right time to suggest that it would be appropriate for safe use. They were under specific conditions, very closely controlled. And in the end, of course, we realized that they weren't effective for COVID-19. However, because these were referenced in every press conference, in the media so frequently, as also Chris mentioned, whenever these stories are told or when there's references made, it escalates. Pandemics are nothing new. We have had these from really the beginning of time. We are now in a position where we have technology. We were able to map the viral genome online incredibly quickly. Really, we should be able to respond to technology to contain this pandemic so much more quickly than, say, in the previous eras where we had to take this old-fashioned approach of being all locked indoors. Yet here we are. The negative side of our technologies, the darker side of this, is that now we have not only fighting the epidemic, but the infodemic, as the World Health Director General has recently said. We also have online so the spreading of misinformation and disinformation, the difference between the two being that one is unintentional, the other one is more directly politically weaponized, and it isn't intentional. But what we saw is direct results. So we can see that we're having more and more reference to hydroxychloroquine. We don't know if it actually works immediately. And we have a rise in falsified hydroxychloroquine. because at this early stage of the pandemic, there was that primordial fear of this novel virus. And 300 pharmacies and hospitals in the African region in Niger, as well as the DRC, actually had verified falsified cases that the WHO identified. And this isn't in the bazaars or in the black market. These are in the healthcare system. So part of the this platform that you had mentioned, that these various personas feed into, play into, have really moved the direction in which what medicines are going to be at risk. We had hydroxychloroquine. Now that dexamethasone shows this is a very powerful corticosteroid. It has anti-inflammatory effects, immunosuppressant effects. And for very ill patients that are in hospital, it was shown to be very effective. Again, media attention, more cases reported of falsified medicines. So this is the link that I see between the two. But how do we fix this? It's a whack-a-mole problem.
And is there a role that organizations like the UN or the WHO can play in controlling these sorts of personas who are fear-mongering?
Well, I think from experience we can see that we cannot, and when attempts are made to, it only in some ways fuels the fire. And because it feeds into this rumor mill, which again it is not new. So criminals also then take advantage when there is this mass fear, mass panic, when there is unrest. And if we go back through history, we have the post-World War II, when there was drug shortages of antibiotics. Criminals made they took the opportunity to make profit in that particular moment. But even now, Chris mentioned that there were rumors around different types of potions and remedies and herbal tonics that people can drink. These were spread on social media. In Iran, 44 people died. They ingested what was essentially a toxic ethanol solution because it was supposed to be a cure. It was supposed to heal them. It was supposed to protect them from the coronavirus. And they trusted this information. Again, maybe in another scenario, if they're outside of a pandemic, we wouldn't necessarily see this. The other example that comes to mind, again, bringing back to personas, are the suggestions of injecting disinfectants and then the subsequent rise of poison control centers in the United States. So do I think that we can legitimately censor people who have these massive platforms? I don't think that is the case. You have to make a persuasive argument, a counter argument, a persuasive counter argument that touches on those three things Chris mentioned earlier: the heart, the head, and the hand, so that people know how to take care of themselves and can have that skill of being able to identify, well, where is this information coming from? Is this, would there be bias in this? Is this legitimate? And this is, again, where I think universities, education, we should be teaching these skills to children. It should start very young. We should be including the education sector in this. But I think that you cannot clamp down on this very effectively. Again, fake medicines are on websites. 2,500 have been shut down, all related to coronavirus. Corona spray, fake masks, etc. You shut one down, another website pops up.
Yeah.
So you have this continuous problem. By analogy, if you try to almost forcefully redirect the conversation or censor people who are spreading misinformation, I think you'll have an opposite effect, in which their supporters will be even more emboldened by the injustice of that act rather than engaging the discussion itself. But I'm sure that Rob will also have some views on how to effectively take on some of these personas that you have mentioned.
Yeah, and I'd like to bring Rob back in again, actually. You can sort of address that point. And also a question that we've had from a person is that, is the UN or WHO thinking about putting an emphasis on teaching critical thinking, so what you were just saying, Oksana, and rationale through approach in its educational branches? So is it all about education? Can that solve this problem or this issue or the situation, Rob?
Well, I don't think it's a single bullet, and education is just generally important anyway. So the more we can equip people with the ability to decide between fake and reality and be critical, the better. So that's just a general good in my view. But it is, however you frame it, it's a long-term strategy, right? And I think the sort of thing that's going to be important in the shorter term is applying, if you like, the science of understanding people, right? Psychology and behavioral science, to understand this phenomena. And we can start by recognizing, that at the core of this are fundamental questions about trust. But immediately we can delineate two aspects of trust. So whenever we receive a message, we're evaluating two things and questioning how much we trust each of those two things. And they are, firstly, the messenger, and secondly, the message. Okay, so both are extremely important. And the problem in COVID, seems to me, is that there are challenges for many people in trust around the messenger and the message. So if we look at the messenger, it's the degree to which the actions of governments enhance or diminish the social compact that makes us trust their advice. And there are key questions around that, which will vary according to which country you're in and your perspective. But that's an important dimension. The other thing is, even when we're giving medical advice outside a pandemic, there's a question of where people perceive that advice is coming from. Is it the pharmaceutical industry, and do I have views about the industry which are positive versus negative? Is it a trusted doctor, etc.? So the idea that we can somehow silence voices that are purveying misinformation, I think, is naive. The question is why people trust those voices, and how can we enable our voices to be more trusted? But the second really fundamental point is whether people trust the message. And that's where I think we can get a lot better about how we communicate medical, pharmaceutical treatment messages, for example, the value of vaccines, etc. And that, I think, speaks to what I was saying earlier, and what I think Chris's talk really illustrated was the importance that it's not just information, it's the degree to which the information is perceived by the individual to be salient and real. And I think Chris's story about his attribution of his diminution in sight to his cancer was very redolent of that. And he spoke about the fact that, it's more convincing when you feel it. I'd add a slight caveat to how we understand that. I don't think we should assume from that we need to manipulate people's feelings to get them to do something, but rather understand that often the reason that we feel something is that there has been a change in our beliefs or our defaults about this. And it's that change, that almost eureka moment, which gives us the emotional sensation that makes it salient. So again, I think there are two elements. We need to be questioning and continuing to understand how people trust messengers and how they trust the message.
Yeah. We've had so many really, really interesting questions in the chat, but they're all quite long questions, and I suspect they would take even longer answers. I have a plan of what to do with those questions, which I'll share in a little while. There is one question from David Colquhoun, who's actually written quite a few, but there's one particular one. Now, just to say, David gets the award for the coolest viewer on this chat because he's been smoking a pipe in his room, and it's absolutely entertaining. Thank you, David, for that. So the question, I'm going to put this to Christopher, is that the idea that the arts can cure anything might come under the heading of false information. What do you think about that, Chris?
Yes. I think if you want to look at the evidence of that, I would refer you to the WHO report that came out of our Copenhagen office last November on the evidence base for the health benefits of the arts. And it shows the range of RTCs and different studies that have been done across the spectrum of what we would call healing through the arts. And that could be everything from physical rehabilitation through dance and music. It could be through arts therapy from the mental health point of view, a wide variety of different approaches. But I think when we talk about the healing value of the arts, we should go back to the 1947 WHO Constitution and its definition of art, of health. In it states that health is not merely the absence of disease, but the attainment of the highest level of physical, mental, and social well-being. And in that sense, the arts are one of the most successful mechanisms that we have developed to address, really, in some ways, all three of those senses of well-being. But yes, I'm not a big believer in magical thinking. I don't think that watching a particular movie is going to cure my cancer. But I do believe that being able to share an experience with a group of people emotionally has a cathartic effect that can, if not help with your healthy state, certainly can add meaning to it. When I was on full chemo, I did a foolish thing. I wrote a play and produced it in New York. And at that time, rather than staying home and convalescing and doing what any sane person would do, I had blisters on my feet. I had blisters in my mouth. I couldn't walk. I couldn't talk. But when I was on that stage working with those actors, I felt a profound sense of well-being. And was that distraction? Was that the endorphins? I don't know. But I do know that because of practicing the arts, I was able to find a meaning in that journey. And even if the cancer had taken its toll and my life had ended, I think the arts helped me give that experience a meaning and a closure that I wouldn't have necessarily otherwise had. It reduced my suffering.
Well, that's. I think there are many people out there who share that same, who have the same view, and they share that same experience. We're going to end in literally a minute, so I'm going to just have a quick question to Oksana before we draw this to a close. Oksana, what quick advice can you give us right now to try to at least play our part in controlling the spread of fake news?
I think that's a great question, because it shows that we all have a collective responsibility in the pandemic. And I think that thinking about where a piece of information comes from first, and also challenging as the way that Chris did in non-threatening ways, but just asking some relevant questions that can help people who are confused about certain issues, because actually we've had so many U-turns, we've had so many policy changes. From 1 month to the next, the advice is different. So that also feeds into perhaps the lack of trust in the scientific experts who are standing side by side with politicians. At least generally, people are wary of politicians for other reasons. So I think that there are I don't think combative responses are helpful in this. I think it's divisive. I think it puts people into tribal camps, one against the other. I think actually asking challenging questions, really trying to get to the root of how experts are coming to these decisions, full transparency as much as possible from the various bodies that are involved with this, including Public Health England, will be very helpful for the larger audiences. They need to be present. They need to be communicating. And those tough questions have to be asked. We talked earlier about the one-to-one debates. I think definitely we need to be seeing more, not just one-to-one, but a broader spread of individuals and more opportunity for people to join these conversations. So I think actually maybe we're onto something by starting with this today. And I see that there have been some very detailed questions from David in the audience that Rob has done a good job in addressing. And there was another comment around whether the storytelling could actually be harmful. One of the good stories that we could perhaps go back to is Albert Camus' The Plague, which is fiction, but really lays out some of the philosophical challenges that all of us as human beings face in a fictional scenario, but where the truth teller in that story is also then punished. And to perhaps find some bravery as an individual to seek the truth, to understand the truth, and to share that truth with others.
Wonderful. What a great note to end on. I want to say a massive thank you to Christopher, to Rob, and to Oksana for really joining us today, sharing your wonderful knowledge and your experience and your stories, Christopher. Also a special thanks to Sarah Garfield at the School of Pharmacy for really reaching out and making this event happen. And also to Helena Pike at UCL Culture, who's the one who introduced us and made this event happen. I hope we can work with the UCL School of Pharmacy and the World Health Organization in the near future